I had planned a simple overnight camping trip along the river, thinking it would be peaceful. The kind of place where the sound of rushing water lulls you to sleep and the smell of wet pine fills the air. I set up my small tarp a few meters from the riverbank, careful to stay on slightly higher ground. By early evening, the sky was already thick with dark clouds, but I had underestimated how quickly it would turn against me. By midnight, the first heavy drops had started, but I thought it was just a passing shower. I should have packed up and moved, but stubbornness and the hope that it would pass kept me where I was. By 2 a.m., the rain was no longer gentle. It came down in sheets, hammering everything around me. The river, which had been calm and soothing earlier, was now a fast, churning wall of water, roaring as if it had grown teeth overnight. Each flash of lightning lit the world in stark white, and each crack of thunder shook the ground. I counted them at first, trying to get a sense of distance, but soon I stopped. The sound was too violent, too close, and every strike left me frozen for a moment, the air sharp and metallic smelling of ozone. My tarp, flimsy against the torrent, offered little protection. Water pooled under it, soaking me to the bone. My supplies, scattered around the campsite, were already floating in shallow streams forming around the roots of nearby trees. My backpack, which I had stashed a little higher, shifted in the mud with every gust of wind. A flash of white lit up the riverbank, and in that instant, I saw a tree less than 50 feet away take the full force of a strike. It exploded in a splintering shower of wood and sparks, scattering my remaining dry items and making me jump so hard I nearly lost my balance. The air stung with electricity. My heart raced. Every instinct screamed at me to get somewhere safer, but the river had already started rising in frightening increments. The ground where I had pitched my tarp was muddy and slick, and the thought of stepping into the water to retrieve anything seemed insane. I crouched low, trying to make myself as small as possible under the dripping fabric, shivering violently. My clothes were clinging to me, and I could feel the cold seeping into my bones. Every loud crack of thunder made my chest tighten, and I could see the reflection of lightning on the water's surface, making it look like the river itself was alive, thrashing and ready to sweep me away. I tried to think clearly. If I stayed here, a strike could hit me directly, or the river could take me. If I tried to move, the slick ground and the rising water were equally deadly. My mind ran through scenarios rapidly. Climbing a tree was too dangerous. Attempting to run along the bank risked being swept away, and moving downhill meant descending into deeper mud and potential flash floods. I pressed myself lower, trying to make myself a smaller target, wrapping my arms around my knees. The sound of water hitting rocks and trees was deafening, and every few seconds, a new lightning strike lit up the riverbank in violent bursts. One struck close enough that the smell of charred wood and ozone burned my nose and throat. I realized I couldn't wait this out under the tarp. The water was inching closer, and if it rose a few more feet, I would be trapped completely. I made a decision. Slowly, carefully, I began to crawl along the muddy embankment, hugging the bank of the river but keeping just far enough away to avoid being pulled in. Every step was deliberate, tested with my foot before my weight shifted. My hands sank into the mud repeatedly, slick and cold. I slipped twice and had to pull myself up, mud coating my face and hands, mixing with the rain so it was impossible to tell where dirt ended and water began. The thunder seemed to follow me, each echoing crash making me flinch and stumble. I avoided the larger trees, not wanting to risk being the next target of lightning, and kept to areas with minimal canopy. My backpack had slipped down the embankment, and I had to leave most of my gear behind. Nothing was worth the risk of being swept into the river. Every flash of lightning revealed just how quickly the water was rising, already lapping at the roots of trees that had been safely above it hours before. By 3 a.m., my clothes were saturated through and through. I could feel my skin numbing from the cold, and every muscle ached from tension and effort. My hands, raw from gripping muddy roots, shook as much from exhaustion as from fear. I stumbled over a fallen branch and nearly went headfirst into a pool that had formed in a low spot. My stomach twisted, and I forced myself to keep moving, to keep my weight low, to avoid slipping. Somewhere downstream, I could hear the muffled sound of debris striking rocks, branches being torn free and carried away. It sounded like the river was swallowing the forest itself. I prayed silently that no large tree would come crashing down the same way the one had earlier. Every instinct screamed to get away from the river, but moving uphill meant wading through increasingly sticky mud, thick and treacherous. By 4 a.m., after hours of crawling, sliding, and clawing my way through the mud, I reached a slightly elevated ridge where the water had not yet reached. I collapsed onto it, letting the rain pound on me, not caring any more about getting soaked. My lungs burned from shallow breathing, and my fingers felt stiff and useless. I could hear the river still roaring below me, carrying everything in its path. The thought of sleeping was laughable. My mind wouldn't let me. I stayed in that spot, eyes darting to every shadow, every ripple on the water. I could see the remains of the tree that had been struck, half submerged now, a jagged skeleton jutting out like a warning. The river had grown several feet in height, swelling far beyond anything I had imagined. My stomach growled. I had nothing to eat, nothing to dry myself with, no dry clothes. I had survived the immediate danger, but the storm was far from over. By dawn, the rain had eased slightly to a steady drizzle, and the sky began to lighten in dull shades of gray. The river, still swollen and fast, had reached a terrifying new height. I spent hours navigating through mud, fallen branches, and shallow pools, moving cautiously downhill and away from the river. My boots were heavy with mud and water, my hands raw and bleeding from gripping roots and rocks. Every shadow along the trail looked like a potential threat. Every sound made me jump, but I forced myself to keep moving. I stayed close to the edge of the trail where trees were sparse, avoiding any chance of lightning. By mid-morning, I finally reached a point where the ground leveled out and the water from the river could not reach me. I was exhausted, soaked, covered in mud, hungry, and shaking from both cold and adrenaline. Eventually, after careful, slow hiking, I reached the trailhead where cars had been parked. Mud streaked my face and clothes, my gear was ruined, and I felt completely drained, but I was alive. The rain had stopped entirely by then, leaving only puddles and dripping trees behind me. I walked back to my car, each step feeling like a small victory. I took a moment to sit inside, warm and dry for the first time in hours, breathing in the smell of wet leather and heated interior. My heart was still racing, my body still trembling, but I allowed myself a small sense of relief. I had survived, not through luck, but through careful observation, patience, and a willingness to act despite fear. I realized I had underestimated the river and the storm, but I also recognized my own limits and how far I could push myself without breaking. The gear was gone, the tarp ruined, but the experience had left me alive and wiser. As I drove away, mud splattering the tires, I glanced back at the swollen river cutting through the forest like a living thing. It had claimed everything I left behind, and it would keep moving until the storm subsided, reshaping the banks and erasing my campsite entirely. I felt a strange mix of exhaustion and respect. Nature had reminded me that survival wasn't about bravery or skill alone, but about reading the environment, calculating risks, and knowing when to act. I would remember this night forever, the cold, the mud, the thunder, the lightning that had struck so close, and the river that could have taken me if I had hesitated for even a moment. I drove on in silence, wet clothes sticking to me, heart finally slowing, knowing that the next time I camped near water, I would never take its power lightly again. I was driving home from a construction job at 1:30 in the morning. The fog was thick over Route 19, hanging low and heavy, clinging to the pavement like a wet blanket. Everything looked blurry and muted, the lines on the road barely visible through the white-gray haze. My truck's headlights cut through only a few dozen feet ahead, leaving the rest of the world swallowed in shadows. I'd been on my feet all day, moving steel beams, climbing scaffolding, sweating and cursing under the sun, and the long drive home should have been simple, almost meditative. But that night, something about the fog made the road feel wrong, like it was pressing in on me. I missed my usual turn. It was one of those moments you barely notice until it's too late. I blinked, cursed under my breath, and spotted a smaller gravel road branching off to the side. It wasn't on my map, at least not one I was paying attention to, but it looked like it might loop back to my neighborhood. I slowed to make the turn, feeling a little irritated with myself for being tired, for not paying attention. Gravel crunched under my tires as I took the road, and the fog seemed to thicken even more, blanketing the area in a near-white haze. Trees pressed close on either side, their dark shapes blotting out any landmarks. The air smelled damp and earthy, heavy with the scent of wet soil and decaying leaves. After about a quarter mile, my headlights caught something in the ditch on the right side of the road. My stomach dropped. A man was standing there, shirtless, his skin pale in the reflection of the headlights. At first, I thought maybe it was a deer or some other animal, the shape distorted by the fog. Then he lifted his arms in a slow, deliberate motion, like he was trying to cover his face. His movements were jerky, unnatural, and deliberate. He didn't flinch when my headlights hit him. He didn't even seem to register me. My mind raced. The isolation of the road, the dead silence except for the crunch of my tires, made everything feel sharper, more immediate. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. It was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. My hands tightened around the steering wheel. The truck felt suddenly too big, too slow, and I realized I was frozen for a moment, staring at him. My mouth went dry. My pulse hammered in my temples. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The man stayed there, arms raised, eyes seemingly blank, not moving at all. I pressed the brake lightly, then my foot hovered, unsure. I felt trapped, watching him, feeling like the next second could decide everything. My body screamed to move, to get away, but it was slow, mechanical, almost like my mind was lagging behind my instincts. Then finally I floored it. The tires crunched over the gravel as I swerved slightly to the left, just barely missing the man. My chest heaved. I couldn't tell if he moved at all, or if he had stayed where he was. I didn't look back. The truck's engine roared, and the headlights pierced through the fog in jagged beams. The road narrowed, and the trees seemed to lean closer as I sped by. I didn't slow down. I couldn't. The road ended abruptly at a dead end, opening up into a small parking area next to an abandoned gas station. Rusted pumps leaned at odd angles, peeling paint flaking off the metal like thin paper. The building's windows were dark, dusty, and cracked. A faded sign, half-ripped, swung weakly in the foggy wind. I hit the brakes hard, my chest burning, my eyes scanning for any movement. Everything was still, quiet, and wrong. I took a deep breath, trying to calm down. My hands shook, gripping the steering wheel tightly. The truck idled, the engine the only sound in the emptiness. I pulled my phone from the console. No bars. Typical for that area, but it felt more isolating than usual. I tried again, waiting for the signal, my thumb hovering over the screen as I dialed 911. The fog seemed to press even closer around the truck. My headlights cut through it, but it felt like the light didn't reach far enough, like the world ended just a few feet beyond the hood. I could hear the gravel shift slightly behind the truck, my imagination twisting every small noise into something terrifying. I held my breath, straining to see anything in the fog, my stomach knotted tight with tension. Eventually, I got a weak signal and called the police. I explained where I was, what I saw. They said they would send someone out, but that it might take time given the location. I waited, shifting nervously in my seat, scanning the shadows. But when they arrived, and a patrol car combed the area, there was no one. No footprints in the gravel, no sign of the man, nothing but the wind rustling the broken sign and the fog curling around the abandoned pumps. I watched the police search, feeling a mix of relief and confusion. How could someone standing in a ditch, so close, vanish without a trace? The mind wants to rationalize. Maybe it was someone hiding, a prank, or someone running off into the woods. But the way he had just stood there, completely still, had left me frozen in fear. After that night, I never took back roads at night again. Route 19 became my only path home, even if it added extra miles. Every foggy night, my stomach still knots when I see a shadow in the ditch or a figure moving in the distance. I drive slowly, headlights sweeping over the edges of the road, ears straining for any unusual sound, hands gripping the wheel as if it could somehow protect me. I check my mirrors constantly, scanning for shapes that shouldn't be there, even when nothing is visible. Every small sound, rocks falling, tree branches scraping, distant dogs barking, sets my nerves on edge. The memory of that man, standing there shirtless, arms lifted as if to hide, burns in my mind. I think about the way he didn't react, didn't move, didn't blink. The fact that he was there and then gone, leaving no trace, makes me distrust the quiet, the dark, the fog. Eventually, I learned to stay alert at all times when driving alone, especially at night. My routine changed, keeping my phone fully charged, avoiding any shortcuts, never underestimating the isolation of empty roads. I tell myself it was probably a transient, someone struggling with who knows what, but my gut refuses to accept that entirely. Even rational explanations don't soothe the unease that grips me whenever I remember the hollow eyes in the headlights. I still drive that route home every night from construction jobs or other late shifts, but I stick to the main road, follow the familiar lines, and never, ever take back roads when the fog rolls in. I keep my windows up, my music off, and my eyes on the edge of the road, scanning for movement, ready to accelerate if necessary. That night taught me something fundamental. The world can shift in an instant. Something that seems normal one moment can become threatening the next. And the simplest choice, missing a turn, taking a gravel road, can bring you face to face with a danger that isn't supposed to exist, at least not where you are. I've tried to forget it, but it stays with me. The fog, the ditch, the man standing there, unmoving, arms raised, and the sharp, panicked sense of almost hitting him. Every time I drive that stretch of Route 19, my pulse quickens at the thought of another wrong turn, of ending up on a road I shouldn't be on. It's been years, but I still plan my routes carefully, check the maps twice, and avoid shortcuts like the plague. The fear is practical now, like a survival instinct hardened into habit. I learned that night that some encounters leave you with more than just a story. They leave a mark that changes the way you move through the world, the way you weigh every decision, the way you look at the fog, the night, and the empty spaces where a person can appear and vanish without a trace. That road still exists, the gravel still crunches under tires, the abandoned gas station still waits at the end of the dead end. But I never go there. I know what can happen when you do, and I trust that memory more than anything else. I learned to respect the night, to respect the empty spaces, and to never assume that being alone makes you safe. That man, whatever he was, taught me a lesson I won't ever forget. I can't explain it fully. I can't even prove it happened beyond my word, but it changed me. I drive home every night now with a constant awareness, scanning the edges, wary of shadows, aware of every inch of the road. I can't unsee him, and I never will. I've made peace with that, and I've learned to survive around it, but the memory is sharp, always there, like the echo of gravel under tires in the fog. I was 8 years old, and the world felt enormous and unknowable that winter. My family had rented a farm outside town for the season, a wide stretch of fields blanketed in snow, untouched and sparkling under the weak winter sun. The air smelled sharp, bitter in the way it always does before the sky turns gray with clouds, and every breath I took seemed to sting my lungs. I remember thinking that day how quiet everything was, the kind of quiet that pressed against your ears until it almost hurt, broken only by the distant bleat of a cow or the soft crunch of snow under my boots. I had wandered farther than I should have. My siblings were somewhere closer to the house, and I wasn't paying attention to them. The snow was deep, and it swallowed my legs with every step. I loved the way it puffed up around me, soft and powdery at first, but I should have been careful. There were patches where the snow hid the uneven ground beneath, areas disturbed by animals or farm machinery. I was crossing one of the back fields, moving between the tall, frozen stalks of corn left from last season, when I didn't see it, a hole, dug by one of the bulls the farmer had kept in a corral for the winter. I fell. It wasn't a slow tumble. I just sank into it, the snow rising immediately to my chin, trapping me in its icy clutch. My arms flailed, but the snow was heavy and compacted from the weight of the winter. I couldn't lift myself. My legs thrashed beneath me, but there was nothing to grip, nothing to hold onto, just more snow pressing in with every motion. I screamed, a sound swallowed almost immediately by the stillness of the field. The wind wasn't strong enough to carry my voice far, and there was no one close enough to hear. I remember panic rising first as a dull, hot pressure in my chest. I was cold, yes, but the cold didn't come first. Fear came first. Pure, sharp, raw fear. I stared up at the pale winter sky, trying to see shapes in the faint stars peeking through the clouds, and I prayed, in the only way I knew how, that someone would come. I kept calling out, but the sound seemed wrong to me, too small, too weak. Time slowed. Seconds stretched endlessly, each one filled with the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears, echoing against the walls of snow surrounding me. I couldn't see the edges of the hole. The snow was so high it pressed against my shoulders, and my head barely cleared the rim. I was trapped, completely alone in that frozen pit. The cold began to sink in then, starting in my fingers and toes, spreading like it had a mind of its own. I wiggled my hands and pulled at my coat, trying to break through the crust of snow around me, but it was solid and unyielding. My boots sank deeper into the snow when I kicked, and then I realized they were gone, pulled off in the struggle. My socks were wet almost immediately, cold and clinging to my skin. I couldn't feel my toes anymore, and the numbness was spreading up my legs. I knew I had to get out, or I might not make it. I started digging with my hands, pushing snow away in desperate, frantic motions. The cold bit at my skin, making it ache and sting, but I didn't stop. I used my elbows, I pressed my face into the snow to shove it aside, anything to create space. My small fingers scraped over ice beneath the snow, leaving tiny cuts that bled into the white powder, but I didn't care. Every second felt like a lifetime. I was completely alone, suspended between fear and exhaustion, my chest burning from the effort and the panic. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably less than 30 minutes, I felt air on my face again. My arms were raw and bruised, my hands numb and bleeding, but I had made a small tunnel. I wriggled forward, kicking through the remaining snow, and managed to pull myself out onto the surface. My legs gave way underneath me, and I collapsed in the snow, gasping, tasting ice in my mouth. I was free, but I wasn't safe yet. The farm was still empty. The house was far off, and the snow had erased any familiar footprints I might have followed. My socks and feet were wet and cold, my fingers stiff and trembling. But the field was open, and the night was coming fast. I had to get home. I could see the fence now, a barbed wire line marking the edge of the property. It looked impossibly tall from my position in the snow. I dragged myself forward, hands clutching at the icy strands of wire, carefully maneuvering my body so I didn't tear my skin on the sharp barbs. I inched along, inch by inch, feeling the barbs scrape against my legs, against my arms, until finally I had crossed over to the other side. My socks were ruined, frozen solid, but I had made it. By the time I got to the house, my face was red and raw from the wind and cold, my hair stuck to my forehead with frost. My parents were standing at the door, eyes wide, glancing between me and the darkening field. They didn't understand at first. My siblings had said I was just playing outside, so there was no panic on their faces, just confusion. I didn't have the energy to explain. I could barely speak. I sank onto the steps, shivering uncontrollably, exhausted, wet, and terrified. That night, under the blankets in my room, I couldn't stop thinking about the hole, about the snow rising to my chin, about how alone I had been. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the sky through the rim of the pit, the faint stars twinkling above me, impossible to reach. Sleep came slowly, and even when it did, I dreamed of snow swallowing me again, of being trapped and screaming with no one there to help. The winter after that, every time I walked alone through snowdrifts, I felt that panic return, subtle but sharp, like an echo of the fear I had felt that day. I would walk more carefully, testing the snow with my foot, listening for any hint of hollows beneath the surface. Every step reminded me of that frozen pit and the hours, or moments, that had felt like eternity. It changed the way I moved in the snow. I never ran blindly into drifts, never ignored the uneven ground, never assumed that the world was safe just because it was quiet. I learned to pay attention to details, to anticipate danger even when none seemed visible. And I learned most of all that fear could be overcome with determination, that even when the cold and the snow seemed endless, even when my body was failing and my mind was panicked, I could dig, inch by inch, and climb, step by step, until I was free. By the end of that winter, I had built a quiet resilience. The snow no longer held the same terror over me, though the memory never fully disappeared. I walked alone through drifts with awareness now, with caution, but also with a strange, hard-earned confidence. I knew what it meant to face something bigger than yourself, something that seemed insurmountable, and survive. That memory of being trapped in the bull's hole, staring up at the sky, trembling in cold and fear, stayed with me for years, but it no longer haunted me. Instead, it became a reminder of how strong I could be, how carefully persistence and determination could carry you through even the most hopeless-seeming moments. I never forgot to test the snow beneath my feet again, never ignored the silent threats of a frozen field, and I never underestimated my own ability to survive. That winter was harsh, yes, but it taught me more than fear. It taught me resilience, and for that, I carried a quiet, stubborn gratitude for the winter that could have killed me, but instead taught me how to live carefully, attentively, and bravely. I had been planning this solo trip for weeks, carefully mapping out a ridge along the Appalachian Trail that offered seclusion and a panoramic view of the surrounding mountains. The hike up had been strenuous, but the sun was still hanging low when I set up my small tent near the crest, just off the main path, where the ground was level and covered in a thick layer of dead leaves. I made sure to secure everything, double-checking my tent stakes, arranging my backpack against a tree, and laying out my minimal gear so it was easy to reach if I needed to move quickly. I had planned to spend the night here alone, something I had done before but never on a ridge this exposed. There was a certain thrill to it, the kind that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand on end even on a calm evening. As night fell, a thin mist began to creep up the mountainside, and by 10, it had turned into a dense fog that seemed to press against the tent walls. I could barely make out the ridge line, or even the trees directly in front of me. I told myself it was normal, that this part of the mountains was notorious for sudden fog, especially in the fall, and I tried to ignore the rising tension in my chest. I cooked a simple dinner, the smell of canned beans filling the tiny vestibule of my tent, and drank water straight from my bottle. Every crackle of leaves or distant snap of a twig made me flinch, but I chalked it up to the forest. There were deer and raccoons in these parts, and I had read that black bears sometimes moved along the ridges at night. Still, there was a weight in the air that felt different, something heavier than just the fog and the night itself. Around 11, as I lay on my sleeping pad staring at the tent ceiling, I thought I heard something, a slow, deliberate crunching on the dead leaves above the ridge. My heart jumped, but I told myself it was probably an animal, a deer maybe, moving along the trail I hadn't noticed. I forced myself to breathe evenly, counting each inhale and exhale, trying to convince myself it was normal. Then I heard it again, closer this time, distinct and heavier than a deer would make, the sound of boots, or at least shoes with some solid sole, pressing into the forest floor. My stomach tightened. I didn't move. I stayed perfectly still, listening. The sound wasn't erratic like an animal's would be. It had a rhythm, deliberate and steady, like someone was walking along the ridge, and each step was measured. Then I saw it. Through the fog, just beyond the rim of the ridge, and silhouetted faintly by the dim moonlight struggling through the clouds, a shadow appeared. It was tall, broad at the shoulders, moving along the crest with a slow, deliberate gait. I could make out the shape of a human, though the fog blurred the edges. My first instinct was to panic, but I forced myself to stay down, to stay quiet. My eyes followed it as it traced the ridge, moving with purpose, not searching, not random, just walking. I felt the sweat run down my back, cold despite the humid air. I could hear my heart thumping in my chest, loud enough that I was sure anyone nearby could hear it. My mind raced with possibilities. Hiker, hunter, someone lost, someone dangerous. The rational part of me wanted to make noise, to announce my presence, but instinct screamed at me to stay hidden. I had seen enough survival shows and read enough wilderness guides to know that sometimes staying quiet was the difference between safety and risk. The shadow paused at a dip along the ridge, then continued moving along, slowly, methodically. I counted the seconds, minutes maybe, though it was impossible to tell in the fog. Eventually, it disappeared, swallowed by the white haze that had become nearly impenetrable. My whole body remained tense, ears straining for the return of any sound, every hair on my arm standing on end. I didn't dare move for what felt like hours, though in reality it was probably closer to half an hour. I had planned to sleep here, to enjoy the ridge at night, but the idea of closing my eyes seemed impossible. My imagination ran wild with scenarios, each one more dangerous than the last, and every time a branch snapped, I jumped. I could hear small animals scurrying through the underbrush, their movements exaggerated by my fear. By the time the fog began to thin slightly, it was nearly 5 a.m. I hadn't slept a wink. My sleeping bag, once comforting, felt like a cage. My mind had been replaying the shadow over and over, imagining where it could have gone, whether it had seen me, whether it was still out there waiting. I packed my tent methodically, double-checking every strap, every zipper, every item. I took down the stakes and rolled up the sleeping pad, securing it tightly to my backpack. I left nothing behind that could attract attention. Food, trash, even a single wrapper. My movements were deliberate, slow, careful, but my heart never stopped racing. I decided to abandon my original plan of staying on unmarked paths and ridges. The forest had felt open and dangerous at night, but the main trail was wide, clear, and predictable. I set off at first light, moving quickly but cautiously, constantly glancing over my shoulder. Every shadow seemed exaggerated, every movement in the trees a potential threat. I kept my eyes on the trail ahead, but never let the ridge out of sight on my left. It felt impossible to fully relax. The fog lingered in pockets along the valleys, rolling and swirling, creating illusions of movement where there was none. I forced myself to walk steadily, one foot in front of the other, until the ridge began to slope down toward a familiar junction I had memorized from the trail map. By the time I reached a small clearing, the sun had begun to pierce through the mist, cutting shafts of golden light across the forest floor. I paused to catch my breath and looked back at the ridge I had just descended. It looked peaceful now, almost serene, the kind of quiet that belied the tension I had felt hours earlier. There was no shadow, no sign of the figure. Just trees and the morning mist, drifting lazily through the trunks. My body, still tense from the night, began to loosen slightly, the adrenaline fading enough that I could think clearly again. I continued down the main trail, my pace slow but steady, every step lighter than before, though my senses remained on high alert. By mid-morning, I had rejoined a busier section of the Appalachian Trail, hikers moving in both directions, their voices carrying through the forest. The normalcy of it, the casual conversations, laughter, footsteps on dirt, was almost shocking after the night I had endured. I kept a casual distance from the others, not wanting to share the story, yet not wanting to appear suspicious. When I reached the parking area where I had left my car, I felt an almost overwhelming relief, the kind that comes from returning from a place that feels like it could have swallowed you whole. I packed up the last of my gear, checked my maps, and drove off, still glancing in the rearview mirror at the ridge as it disappeared behind me. That night had been terrifying, more so than I had expected. But I had made it out unscathed, and the clarity of daylight reminded me that fear, though real, was something that could be endured. The forest had its dangers, but it was also predictable if you respected it. I didn't know who or what the shadow had been, and I didn't care to find out. I learned to trust my instincts, to prepare carefully, and to value daylight. From that day on, I never camped alone on ridges after dark, and I never underestimated the weight of silence and fog in the mountains. The ridge remained in my memory as a place of both beauty and danger, a stark reminder that the forest was alive in ways we often didn't see, and that survival sometimes meant simply waiting, watching, and walking away when the light returned. I remember the cabin trip like it was yesterday. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small, wooden cabin tucked away in a remote part of the forest. We rented it for a long weekend, hoping to escape the city and just relax. The road leading up to it was barely more than a dirt track, lined with thick trees that blocked out any sense of civilization. The cabin itself was cozy, with a small living area, a fireplace, and 3 tiny bedrooms. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and at night, the forest was alive with the sounds of owls, distant coyotes, and the occasional rustle of leaves. Our plan was simple: cook, drink a little, sit by the fire, and enjoy the silence. The first night was quiet, almost peaceful. After dinner, we sat around the fireplace with beers, talking about nothing important. Around 10, one by one, my friends drifted off to their rooms, leaving me lying awake on the couch, staring at the flames. Sleep came eventually, or at least I thought it did. It was around midnight when I woke to a faint, unfamiliar sound. It wasn't a crack of a branch outside or a wind gust. It was the sound of glass scraping against wood. Slow, deliberate, and faint, but definitely there. At first, I thought it was the wind rattling something outside. I sat up, straining to listen. The noise continued, quiet but distinct. It came from the direction of the neighboring cabin, the one a little ways down the path. There shouldn't have been anyone there. The listing we rented mentioned it was empty, just another cabin on the property for sale. Curiosity and a creeping sense of unease pulled me to my feet. I crept to the window, trying to keep my movement quiet so I wouldn't wake my friends. Outside, everything was dark. The trees swayed gently in the wind, and the moon cast long, thin shadows over the ground. At first glance, there was nothing. No flicker of light, no movement, just the faint outlines of trees and the cabin next door. I assumed it had to be an animal, probably a raccoon or some stray dog knocking over tools or pieces of firewood. That thought gave me a little comfort, though I still felt my stomach tighten. Then I noticed the window. One of the windows of the neighboring cabin had its blinds slightly raised, just enough to leave a narrow gap. At first, I squinted, hoping I was imagining it. But then I saw it, a silhouette, completely still, standing there, facing our cabin. The figure didn't move, didn't wave, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, staring. I could feel my pulse in my throat. My first instinct was disbelief. Maybe someone had moved into the cabin without notice. Maybe it was the real estate agent checking on the property. But none of it made sense. It was past midnight, and the figure hadn't moved a muscle in the few minutes I watched. I tried to look for details, but all I could make out was a dark shape, tall and thin. My friends were asleep, oblivious to what was happening. I wanted to wake them, to tell someone, but the fear of being wrong made me hesitate. I spent the rest of the night in the living room, alternating between peeking out the window and sitting back against the couch, listening. The scraping sound came occasionally, soft and distant. At times, I thought I saw the silhouette through the trees, sometimes near the edge of the clearing between the cabins. Each time, it was perfectly still, as if it was waiting. I didn't dare leave the cabin to investigate. Every shadow outside seemed larger than it was. Every branch crack made me flinch. I tried to tell myself it was just a person in the woods, someone lost, maybe drunk. But then I remembered how perfectly still the figure had been, how it seemed to watch us like we were prey. As the hours dragged on, the forest noises became more oppressive. The wind shifted in ways that made the trees groan, and every small sound outside felt amplified. I could hear the faint scraping again, moving from one side of the cabin to the other, but always just out of clear sight. I stayed awake until the first hint of light, straining my eyes to see beyond the trees. At sunrise, when the world started to lighten, I finally felt a small sense of relief. The figure was gone. I carefully looked around the neighboring cabin. It looked abandoned, nothing in the yard disturbed except for some tools lying slightly askew. But the window blinds that had been slightly lifted the night before were crooked now, uneven, as if someone had been inside and watched us all night. I didn't say much to my friends when they woke up. There was no proof, and I didn't want to seem paranoid. We packed up slowly, keeping an eye on the other cabin as we loaded the car. The forest seemed normal in the daylight, quiet and unthreatening. Still, the crooked blinds stayed with me. We left the property cautiously, glancing back several times as we drove down the dirt road. Later, when we looked up the property online, the neighboring cabin was listed for sale, empty. No one lived there. No one had permission to be inside. It was just a small, isolated cabin like ours, waiting for someone to buy it. I can't explain what happened that night. I've gone over it in my mind 1,000 times, imagining every scenario: squatters, burglars, someone testing the boundaries of an abandoned property. Whatever it wasn't a friendly presence. The experience left me uneasy for a long time. I still have dreams of standing at that window, staring into the darkness, feeling eyes on me that weren't mine. It changed the way I see empty spaces, how I feel in isolated places. There's a small thrill in going back to nature, but after that weekend, I make sure I'm aware of everything around me, that I check every blind, every shadow, and every gap that could hide someone watching. Even now, I think about that figure and the way it didn't move, didn't blink, didn't make a sound. The way it waited, quietly, just outside the boundary of our awareness. I've never rented a cabin so isolated again, and I never underestimate the stillness of the night. Some things are empty, yes, but sometimes they're only empty until someone decides to watch. And that's enough to keep me awake, remembering a long, quiet night in the woods, feeling the presence of someone who shouldn't have been there, who watched us and then disappeared, leaving nothing but crooked blinds behind. It's a relief to leave the forest behind, to see the lights of town and the sounds of cars and people. But I always carry that memory with me. I know now that isolation can be deceptive, that the quiet of the night is not always a sign of peace, and that someone can exist just out of sight, observing, learning, waiting. The memory doesn't haunt me in a supernatural way. It's just a reminder that the world can be stranger and more dangerous than we like to admit. When I think back, the image of the silhouette, rigid and watching, is as clear as the sunrise over the trees, and that clarity is what makes it impossible to forget. I've told this story many times since then, always leaving out small details that make people uncomfortable. But the truth is simple. We were watched, and the person, or thing, was patient enough to wait until we couldn't see. That weekend taught me to respect the unseen, the unclaimed, and the quiet spaces that seem empty but aren't. And even though we left safely, the crooked blinds remain a reminder that someone had been inside, watching, and then vanished without a trace, leaving only the marks of their observation behind. The memory lingers because it was real, and real danger doesn't need fantasy to make it terrifying. I set out just as the sun dipped behind the peaks, the sky turning the deep purple of early night. I had been hiking in the Tetons for years, often alone, but this time I decided to explore a trail I hadn't seen marked on any of my maps. It was more of a game trail than a proper path, barely wide enough for a single person, and the brush on either side was thick with undergrowth. The air was cold and damp, carrying the earthy smell of pine and moss. The moon was rising, full and bright, casting long, silver shadows across the forest floor. It lit the world in a way that made everything look close, yet impossible to judge distances in, like the shadows were alive, stretching and bending with the uneven ground. At first, the walk was serene. The sound of my boots crunching over gravel and broken branches echoed unnaturally in the stillness. Every snap of a twig made me tense. The forest was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat and the steady breath I tried to control. I felt a mix of excitement and unease. Unmarked trails have a certain thrill, but they also have the risk of carrying you somewhere unintended. My instincts were whispering at me, a subtle warning I tried to ignore. As I moved deeper into the trees, the trail became less clear. Fallen branches and tangled roots threatened to trip me, and in the shadows, every rock and log seemed like it might be a lurking creature. Then I saw it. A massive tree had its bark freshly shredded, its trunk scarred in long, raw gashes. The smell of fresh sap mixed with something more pungent, scat. I knelt carefully, examining it without touching, and my stomach sank. It was unmistakably grisly. I could see the scratch marks from claws on the tree and the tracks around it, wide and deep, as if the animal had come through recently. The forest felt different after that. The energy shifted. Every small sound, the rustle of leaves, the distant snap of a branch, felt amplified. I could sense movement just beyond the rim of vision. My skin prickled. I started to walk more slowly, retracing my steps the way I had come, trying not to make too much noise, but also not wanting to appear like prey. My pack felt heavy suddenly, and every step was careful, deliberate. I clapped occasionally, loud enough to break the eerie silence, knowing that any bear in the area would hear me and realize I was not prey but human. The sound echoed in the forest, bouncing off trees and rocks, and I held my breath for a response. There was none. I realized that I had wandered deeper than I thought. The moonlight was bright, but the shadows it cast were deceptive. Roots and holes in the ground threatened my footing. I had to keep my eyes constantly scanning, my ears straining for any sign of the grizzly. Every crackle and rustle made my chest tighten. At one point, I thought I saw a dark shape move between the trees, but when I froze, it disappeared. My brain wanted to convince me it was just a trick of the shadows, but my gut screamed otherwise. I focused on reaching the main trail. I remembered the way I had come, marking trees in my mind, counting steps between landmarks. I kept clapping intermittently, soft at first, then a little louder, to make sure that anything nearby could hear I was not sneaking. I reminded myself to stay calm, slow my breathing, and not let fear dictate my movements, even though every nerve in my body was screaming. My hands were tight on the straps of my pack, my eyes darting constantly. The underbrush became denser. I had to push branches aside carefully, trying not to make noise. My feet slipped occasionally on damp moss and loose stones, sending small crashes through the silence that seemed to last forever. The wind picked up slightly, and the sound of leaves brushing against each other made me jump. I had a clear memory of a heavy step, a thump on the earth behind me that wasn't mine. I froze immediately, waiting, listening. There was nothing. I began moving again, faster this time, trying to reach a clearing I knew was ahead. The trail finally opened into a small clearing, and I felt a rush of relief. The moonlight bathed the area, and I could see everything clearly. The edges of the forest, the rocks, the faint outline of the main trail leading out. I paused, listening. There was no movement, no rustling, nothing but the distant calls of nocturnal birds and the occasional breeze through the trees. My hands shook slightly as I unclipped my pack and leaned over, catching my breath. The fear didn't dissipate immediately. It lingered in my chest like a weight. I scanned the edge of the clearing carefully, imagining I might see the grizzly emerge, but it did not. I stayed in the clearing for several minutes, letting my body calm, listening carefully for any signs of danger. Eventually, I began walking along the main trail, the path wide and well-trodden compared to the narrow game trail. The moonlight guided me, and every step felt safer, though my senses remained alert. I reminded myself constantly that this area was wild, that animals lived here, and that caution was my best friend. The forest was still, almost peaceful again, but the tension lingered in my shoulders and in the back of my neck. I reached a wider, open area, a large meadow that sloped down gently, the main trail cutting across it. Here I allowed myself to relax slightly. The air smelled of damp grass and pine, and the moonlight sparkled off dew on the blades. I took deep, steadying breaths and checked over my shoulders one last time. The sounds of the forest had returned to normal, crickets chirping, the occasional flutter of wings. There was no trace of the grizzly, no signs that it had followed me beyond the game trail. By the time I reached my car parked at the trailhead, dawn was just starting to pale the horizon. The forest behind me was silent in a different way now, peaceful and distant. I sat in my car for a long time before starting the engine, letting the reality of the night settle in. I knew I had been close to danger, closer than I wanted to think about. The shredded tree and fresh scat were reminders that the wilderness was unpredictable and that I had been lucky to exit safely. I never went back to that unmarked trail. Even months later, I would recall the way the shadows seemed alive, the feeling of being watched, and the sound of the earth shifting subtly behind me. It was a memory that made me respect the forest more deeply. Hiking had always been about freedom and solitude, but that night taught me that it also demanded awareness, caution, and humility. I stuck to marked trails after that, choosing safety over curiosity, remembering vividly how quickly the wilderness could shift from serene to threatening. The forest stayed quiet, but I could still hear it in my mind. The muffled snaps of branches, the faint rustle of leaves, the lingering smell of pine, and something wilder. I carried the lesson with me every time I returned to the mountains. The wilderness is alive, and survival often depends on noticing the smallest signs, moving carefully, and knowing when to turn back. That night had ended safely, but it left a lasting impression, a deep respect for the creatures and the world that moved silently just beyond sight. I never underestimated it again. I had spent the entire day at the logging site, sweating under the sun while the machines chewed through thick pines and oaks. The air smelled of freshly cut wood, resin, and damp soil. By late afternoon, the work was done for the day, and the forest around me was quiet except for the occasional caw of a crow or the distant thump of falling logs. I decided to camp nearby that night instead of driving the hour back to town. The idea of sleeping under the stars, away from the hum of machinery, felt freeing, even if it was just for one night. I found a small clearing near the edge of the woods, the ground soft with old pine needles, and set up my tent. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest was a deep mix of dark greens and shadows. The air had cooled sharply, and I could see my breath as I moved around, securing my gear and stacking firewood. Everything felt normal at first, calm, peaceful. The kind of calm that makes you notice every little sound. I was just about to light a fire when I heard it. A heavy thud, followed by another, like a tree falling, but too rhythmic, too deliberate. I froze. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I scanned the tree line with the fading light, and that's when I saw it. A massive moose standing among the trees, at the very edge of the clearing. Its antlers spread wide, almost like a wall, catching the last glimmers of the sunset. Its eyes were fixed on me, and something in its stance, the way its body tensed, told me I was intruding. I slowly stepped back, hoping to make myself seem smaller, less threatening. But the moose didn't budge. Its nostrils flared, steam rising as it exhaled, and it made a low, guttural snort. I froze for a moment, heart hammering, thinking maybe it would turn away. Then it shifted forward, and the ground seemed to tremble under its weight. I realized too late that it wasn't going to let me just fade into the night. I turned and ran. My boots sank into the soft earth, slick from a recent rain. Mud splashed onto my legs as I stumbled over exposed roots and low branches. The moose crashed through the underbrush behind me. The sound of hooves against the ground, snapping branches, and the rustle of leaves was terrifyingly close, and the thud of its massive steps was enough to make my stomach lurch. Every instinct screamed to keep moving, even when my legs felt like lead. I slipped once, landing on my hands and knees in a patch of mud, scraping them raw. I tasted the metallic tang of blood, but I didn't stop. I scrambled up, using a fallen log as a boost, my body slick with mud and sweat. My pack dug into my shoulders, but I didn't dare take it off. Behind me, I could hear the moose crashing through the trees again, closer this time. Its anger was tangible in the forest, echoing through the trunks like a drumbeat. I veered off the path I had set, trying to put any obstacles I could between myself and the animal. I jumped over another fallen log, slipping again, catching myself just in time on a thin branch that snapped under my weight. My heart felt like it might burst from my chest. Every breath was ragged, every step uncertain. I felt like I was running forever, but I knew the moose was just as relentless. It didn't slow, didn't hesitate, and that made every second more terrifying. At one point, I saw a shallow ditch up ahead and dove into it, trying to hide, pressing my back against the muddy earth, hoping the animal would move past. For a moment, I thought I'd caught a break. The moose paused, shaking its head, nostrils flaring, letting out a long, low grunt. Then it turned, and I realized I was still in its path. My heart sank, but instinct took over. I scrambled out and ran again, mud and blood mixing on my skin, catching on every branch, every stump, tearing at my clothing. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, I glimpsed my truck parked at the edge of the clearing. My relief was immediate, but I didn't slow down. I ran blindly, slipping one last time in a puddle, scraping my arms on rocks and bark. My chest burned, my lungs felt like they were on fire, and every step was agony, but I couldn't stop. The moose's anger still echoed in the trees behind me, the crashing sounds fading slowly as it stopped chasing, perhaps realizing it had defended its territory. I reached the truck, panting so hard I thought I might pass out. My hands shook violently as I yanked open the door, throwing myself inside and slamming it shut. I locked every door and rolled up the windows, pressing my chest against the steering wheel, trying to catch my breath. My clothes were soaked in sweat, mud, and blood. My arms and legs were scratched and cut, but I was alive. The forest outside seemed calm now, the only sound the soft rustle of leaves and the occasional call of a distant bird. I sat there for a long time, just breathing, trying to process what had just happened. The adrenaline slowly faded, leaving me trembling and exhausted. I realized how close I had come to being seriously hurt, or worse. I had underestimated the moose, underestimated how quickly a large animal could react to an intruder, and underestimated the danger of camping in an active logging area where wildlife moved freely. A single mistake, setting up in the wrong spot, not noticing signs of the animal's presence, could have been fatal. By the time the sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn, I was still in the truck, too shaken to move. I cleaned my hands with a damp rag from my pack, inspecting the cuts and scratches. None of them were life-threatening, but they were enough to remind me that I had been reckless. I started the engine, feeling the vibrations beneath me as a small comfort, and drove slowly back toward the main logging road, keeping my eyes glued to the trees. I didn't want any more surprises. That night, as I finally settled in at a proper campsite near the main road, I made sure my fire was well contained. My tent was far from the forest edge, and every piece of gear was organized to avoid unnecessary noise. I slept lightly, listening to the night around me, thinking about how fragile my safety had been. It wasn't a ghost or a storm that had threatened me. It was the forest itself, its largest and most unpredictable inhabitant. A simple misstep, a wrong choice, and I could have ended up as a casualty in the undergrowth. By morning, I was back on the logging road, heading toward town, every muscle still sore, every sense still alert. I knew I would never forget the weight and power of that moose, the sheer force of its presence, or the sound of its hooves crashing behind me. I had learned a hard lesson that night about respect, caution, and the quiet danger of the wild. From then on, every time I went near the woods, I checked my surroundings carefully, paid attention to the signs, and never underestimated the creatures that called it home. That night had been terrifying, exhausting, and humbling, but it had also made me more aware, more careful, and ultimately more alive. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. 3 days backpacking along a route in the Smoky Mountains, away from crowds, away from cell service, just the forest and the trail. The first 2 days had been challenging but beautiful. Mist clung to the ridges in the morning, sunlight filtered through the canopy in golden shafts, and the creek crossings sparkled in the late afternoon. By the third day, we were all tired, but nothing felt dangerous. That's what made what happened that night so surreal. We set up camp near a small creek around 9 in the evening. The air was cool and damp, the kind of cold that sinks into your bones slowly. We had pitched the tents in a small clearing, just off the main trail, rocks and roots carefully avoided, tarps secured over our packs to keep them dry. A small fire pit had been cleared of leaves and twigs, and the sound of the creek running nearby was steady and soothing. The stars were hidden behind the dense tree canopy, but the faint rustling of leaves hinted at a gentle night breeze. After finishing dinner and washing our few dishes in the creek, I decided to fetch water for the next day. My pack was already heavy, and carrying extra water was important. I took my flashlight and headed along a narrow path through the underbrush, stepping carefully to avoid twisting an ankle on roots or rocks hidden in the dark. The beam of my flashlight cut a narrow cone of visibility through the trees, illuminating the damp leaves and glinting patches of moss on the trunks. Everything was quiet at first. The creek murmured behind me, birds were long gone, insects were mostly silent. It was the kind of quiet where even your own breathing sounds loud. I bent to scoop water into my container and felt the night pressing in on me, thick and still. That's when I heard it. Heavy breathing, just behind me. It was uneven and loud, not humanized in any way, but deep and steady, deliberate. My head snapped up, eyes straining to pierce the darkness beyond my flashlight. Nothing moved. The trees loomed around me, casting long shadows that seemed to shift whenever I tried to focus on them. Then I heard it again, a branch snapping. Slow, deliberate. Not a crack from stepping on a twig, not the scurry of an animal. This was measured, intentional. Whoever, or whatever, was there was aware of me. My heart started to hammer in my chest. I tried to freeze, trying not to breathe too loud, hoping whatever it was would just go away. My flashlight trembled in my hand, and each pulse of its beam made shadows jump in impossible directions. I didn't hear footsteps, just that breathing, close, persistent, almost taunting. The forest seemed impossibly dense, and I realized I was alone. My friends were back at camp, maybe 100 yards away, but that distance might as well have been miles. I backed away slowly, keeping my flashlight aimed forward but glancing around, trying to make myself seem non-threatening. The breathing followed. The sound of snapping branches echoed through the trees, but I still couldn't make out a shape. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth and pine, and my adrenaline sharpened every sense. I realized I had no idea if this was a person, an animal, or someone who might hurt me. Rationally, I knew Smoky Mountain black bears existed, but the sound wasn't right. Bears make noise, they grunt, they scrape. This was methodical, like something studying me. Fear pushed me into motion. I turned and ran. My feet pounded the soft earth, slipping on mossy rocks and roots. My flashlight bobbed wildly, illuminating trees in fleeting glimpses, but nothing followed me visibly. The breathing continued, or maybe it was only in my head now, mixed with my own ragged inhalations. I didn't stop until I burst back into the clearing where the tents were. My friends jumped at the sudden rustle and heavy breathing I didn't even realize I was doing. I didn't speak, I couldn't. I collapsed near the fire pit, gripping my water container like a lifeline, trying to tell myself it was over. The rest of the night passed in a blur of anxious wakefulness. Every little noise, the creak, a snapping twig, an owl hoot, made me flinch. I barely slept. I kept my flashlight within arm's reach, my knife at my side, constantly scanning the tree line. My friends tried to stay calm, but I could tell they felt it too, the unshakable tension of knowing something had been out there watching. By morning, the forest looked completely normal. Sunlight cut through the trees, revealing mossy trunks, ferns, and the small path I had taken. Nothing seemed out of place, but the memory of that breathing, that deliberate presence in the dark, stayed with me. We packed up quickly. The creek sparkled innocently in the sunlight. The air smelled of wet leaves and pine resin, and birds chirped lazily. Everything seemed so ordinary, almost mocking in its calm. We decided to cut the trip short. There was no need to push forward, no need to risk another encounter in the dark. The trail back was long, steep in parts, and exhausting, but the daylight made it bearable. Every once in a while, I would glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see that same shadowy presence, but there was nothing. By mid-afternoon, we were back at the trailhead, the forest behind us calm and still as if nothing had happened. Looking back, the memory of that night is still vivid. The cold press of the dark, the sound of deliberate breathing, the impossibility of seeing what was there, all of it stayed with me. But the ending was clear. We left the forest safely, made it back to our cars, and eventually home. I learned to respect the dark in the Smokies in a way I hadn't before, to trust my instincts, and to never underestimate how alone and vulnerable you can feel in the wilderness. That fear stayed with me for a long time, but it was also a lesson in caution, awareness, and survival. The forest didn't need to be supernatural to be terrifying. It was just wild, unpredictable, and full of things you couldn't see until you were almost too close. Even now, thinking about that night, I can feel the tight knot in my chest, the weight of the unseen presence, the way the forest seemed to close in around me. But I also remember the relief of the morning, the way the sun burned through the fog, and the simple clarity of safety. We made it out. That was the ending, and it was real. The forest was indifferent, the threat was real, and our caution carried us home. The trip was cut short, yes, but it left me with a respect for the Smokies I'll never forget, and a story of fear and survival I carry with me to this day. The water I had fetched was in use that night, but I kept the container as a reminder. Sometimes, when I feel that edge of fear again, I remember the forest, the creek, the heavy breathing, and I also remember stepping out of the dark into sunlight. Safe, unharmed, still alive. And that, more than anything, is what matters.